The frozen air bit at Captain Elena Richter's face as she pressed against the concrete wall of the detention facility. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the compound into a wasteland of white that stretched endlessly toward the alien horizon. Through the barred window of her cell, she could see the strange purple sky of Kepler 442b, a world that had become humanity's newest battlefield in the war against the Zephyrian Empire. Elena pulled her tattered uniform closer to her body, though it provided little warmth against the bitter cold that seeped through every crack in the hastily constructed prison. Around her, 47 other German soldiers sat in similar poses of resignation, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. They had been captured during the failed assault on the Zephyrian mining station 3 weeks ago, and since then, they had been waiting for what everyone knew would come eventually. The Zephyrians were not known for their mercy. Their crystalline forms and emotionless faces had become symbols of terror across human space. When they took prisoners, it was only to extract information through methods that made the old Earth wars look civilized. After that, execution was swift and certain. Elena had seen the recordings from other worlds, had heard the testimonies of the few who had escaped their clutches. She knew what fate awaited her and her soldiers. Lieutenant Sarah Beck, barely 22 years old, sat beside Elena with tears frozen on her cheeks. She had joined the Terran Defense Force only 8 months ago, full of dreams about protecting humanity's expansion into the galaxy. Now she clutched a small photograph of her family back on New Berlin, whispering prayers in German that echoed softly in the cold air. "Capitan," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "Do you think anyone knows we're here?" Elena turned to look at the young woman, seeing her own fears reflected in those frightened eyes. The truth was brutal, but Elena had always believed in honesty with her troops. "The Americans launched their offensive 2 days ago," she said quietly. "If they're coming, it will be soon. But Sarah, you must prepare yourself for the possibility that they might not reach us in time." The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor outside their cell, followed by the distinctive harmonic vibrations that indicated approaching Zephyrians. Elena felt her heart rate increase as she recognized the pattern. 3 guards moving with purpose. This was not a routine patrol. The door to their cell slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing 3 towering Zephyrian warriors. Their bodies were composed of what appeared to be living crystal, refracting the harsh light of the corridor into prismatic patterns that hurt to look at directly. The lead figure's vocal harmonics translated through their universal communicator into cold, precise German. "Prisoners of the Terran Defense Force!" The voice resonated with multiple tones simultaneously, creating an unsettling effect. "You will be transferred to the execution chamber in 1 solar cycle. Prepare your final communications." Elena stood slowly, her joints protesting from the cold and the hard concrete floor. Around her, she could hear quiet sobs and whispered prayers from some of the younger soldiers. Others simply stared ahead, with the blank expressions of those who had already accepted their fate. She had seen this look before, during the siege of Europa Station, when they knew the shields were failing and the enemy bombardment would soon break through. "May we have writing materials?" Elena asked, maintaining eye contact with the lead Zephyrian despite the discomfort it caused. "To send messages to our families?" The crystalline being paused for a moment, light patterns shifting across its surface in what Elena had learned to recognize as their equivalent of contemplation. "This request is acceptable. Materials will be provided in 2 time units." As the guards departed, the cell fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of wind howling across the alien landscape outside. Elena looked around at her soldiers, seeing the weight of despair settling over them like a physical thing. These were good people, trained fighters who had volunteered to protect human colonies on the frontier. They deserved better than to die as prisoners on this frozen world, forgotten and alone. Sergeant Klaus Weber, a veteran of 15 years who had served with Elena since their academy days, cleared his throat and stood up. His uniform was cleaner than most, somehow maintaining a sense of military bearing even in these circumstances. "Capitan, if I may speak freely?" Elena nodded. Military protocol seemed less important now than it ever had. "I want to say that it has been an honor serving under your command," Klaus said, his voice carrying across the cell. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we die as soldiers of the German Republic and members of the Terran Defense Force. Our sacrifice will not be meaningless." A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled prisoners. Elena felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. Even facing certain death, her soldiers maintained their dignity and their loyalty to each other. This was what made humanity special in a galaxy full of cold, logical species like the Zephyrians. Humans could find meaning and hope even in the darkest circumstances. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the gradual fading of the alien daylight outside their window. True to their word, the Zephyrians provided writing materials, rough sheets of synthetic paper and crude styluses that worked despite the cold. Elena watched as her soldiers began writing their final letters home, pouring their hearts onto paper in messages that might never be delivered. She picked up her own stylus and began to write to her sister Maria back on Earth. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as she found herself trying to capture a lifetime of thoughts and feelings in just a few paragraphs. She wrote about the beauty she had seen in the galaxy, about the pride she felt in serving with such brave men and women, about her hope that humanity would continue to reach for the stars despite the dangers they faced. As she wrote, Elena became aware of a sound in the distance. At first, she dismissed it as wind or the movement of their guards. But gradually she realized it was something else entirely. It was rhythmic, mechanical, and growing steadily louder. She looked up from her letter to see Klaus standing near the window, his face pressed against the cold metal of the bars. "Capitan," he said urgently, "you need to see this." Elena rose and moved to the window, peering out into the alien night. What she saw made her heart skip a beat. Lights were moving across the horizon, not the steady glow of Zephyrian vehicles, but the intermittent flashing pattern of human military craft. As she watched, the sound grew louder and more distinct. The deep rumble of human fusion engines, the high whine of atmospheric processors, the distant crack of energy weapons. "Is that—" Sarah began, her voice filled with desperate hope. "The Americans," Elena breathed. "They actually came." The battle raged for hours throughout the night, visible through their window as streaks of light across the dark sky. Elena and her soldiers pressed against the walls as explosions shook the facility around them. She could hear the distinctive sound of human plasma rifles mixing with the harmonic weapons of the Zephyrians, a symphony of war that seemed to move steadily closer to their location. As dawn approached, the sounds of battle began to fade. Elena felt her heart sinking as silence settled over the compound. Had the Americans been defeated? Were they now even more isolated than before? The uncertainty was almost worse than the knowledge of their impending execution had been. Then, in the growing light of the alien morning, they heard new sounds. Human voices speaking English with clear American accents. The sound of boot steps that belonged to human feet, not the crystalline movement of their captors. Elena hardly dared to hope, but as the voices grew closer, she began to make out individual words. "Building secured. Moving to the detention area now." "Copy that, Alpha Team. Be advised, we have confirmed prisoner locations in Sector 7. "Roger. Remember, these are German TDF personnel, friendly forces." Elena felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Against all odds, against all reasonable expectations, the Americans had actually mounted a rescue operation. They had not been abandoned after all. The sound of their cell door being cut open filled the air with the smell of burning metal. Elena stood at attention, trying to present as military a bearing as possible despite their circumstances. Whatever happened next, she wanted to meet their rescuers with dignity. The door fell inward with a crash, and through the smoke and dust stepped 3 figures in the distinctive armor of American Space Marines. Their leader, a tall woman with sergeant's stripes visible on her helmet, surveyed the cell with professional efficiency before removing her helmet to reveal a kind face marked by the stress of recent combat. "Captain Richter?" the sergeant asked in accented but clear German. "I'm Sergeant Martinez, United States Space Marines. We're here to get you folks out of here." Elena stared at Sergeant Martinez for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. After weeks of expecting death, the concept of rescue felt almost impossible to process. Around her, she could hear quiet gasps and murmurs from her soldiers as the reality of their situation began to sink in. The Americans had not only found them, but had fought their way through an entire Zephyrian garrison to reach them. "How many wounded?" Martinez asked, switching to English and speaking into her communicator while simultaneously conducting a visual assessment of the German prisoners. Elena noticed that despite the language barrier, the sergeant's body language conveyed concern and urgency rather than the cold efficiency she had expected from a combat operation. "Sergeant," Elena replied in English, grateful for the language training that had been mandatory for all TDF officers. "We have 3 soldiers with injuries from our capture, but nothing that cannot wait. Our main concern is the cold. We have been without adequate heating for days." Martinez nodded and immediately began issuing orders to her team. "Rodriguez, get those thermal blankets distributed now. Chen, call for medical evacuation for the injured personnel. I want transport ready in 15 minutes. She turned back to Elena with an expression that seemed almost apologetic. "Ma'am, I'm sorry it took us so long to get here. Intel was fragmented, and we had to fight through 3 defensive lines to reach this facility." Elena felt a surge of emotion that she struggled to keep under control. The idea that these American soldiers had risked their lives specifically to rescue German prisoners was almost overwhelming. In the complex web of human politics and military alliances, such cooperation was not always guaranteed, especially in the frontier zones where resources were scarce and every decision carried enormous risk. Marine Rodriguez, a young man who looked barely older than Lieutenant Beck, approached with an armload of silvery thermal blankets. As he began distributing them to the German soldiers, Elena noticed something that struck her profoundly. He was not simply handing out equipment in the efficient manner of a soldier following orders. Instead, he was taking time with each person, making eye contact, offering words of reassurance in broken German, checking to make sure each blanket was properly wrapped around shoulders and securing loose ends. "Danke," Sarah whispered as Rodriguez wrapped a blanket around her shivering form. The young Marine smiled and replied with carefully pronounced German words. "Bitte schön, Fräulein. You are safe now." Elena watched this interaction with growing amazement. These American soldiers had just fought through a heavily defended enemy position, had risked their lives and their mission to rescue foreign nationals, and now they were taking precious time to ensure the comfort and dignity of their charges. This was not the behavior of soldiers following orders or fulfilling treaty obligations. This was something more fundamental, more essentially human. Sergeant Martinez approached Elena again, this time carrying a steaming cup that filled the air with the rich aroma of coffee. "Captain, you look like you could use this. It's not much, but it's warm." Elena accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, whether from cold or emotion she could not say. The coffee was strong and bitter. clearly field rations rather than anything approaching luxury, but it was the first warm thing she had tasted in days. More than the physical warmth, however, was the gesture itself. In the middle of a combat zone, surrounded by enemy forces, this American sergeant had thought to bring comfort to prisoners she had never met. "Sergeant Martinez," Elena said carefully, still processing the surreal nature of their rescue. "May I ask why you came for us? Surely your military resources would be better used elsewhere in this sector?" Martinez paused in her supervision of the evacuation preparations, turning to face Elena directly. For a moment, the professional mask of the combat veteran slipped, revealing something more personal underneath. "Ma'am, with respect, I think you're asking the wrong question. The right question isn't why we came for you. The right question is how we could possibly have done anything else." The sergeant's words hung in the cold air of the cell, carrying a weight that Elena was still trying to fully understand. Around them, American and German soldiers worked together to prepare for evacuation, language barriers overcome by shared purpose and basic human compassion. Elena watched Klaus Weber assist Marine Chen in carrying medical supplies, their communication consisting mostly of gestures and shared determination. "Captain," Martinez continued, "3 weeks ago, we intercepted Zephyrian communications indicating they had taken German prisoners at this location. Command immediately began planning a rescue operation, not because of treaties or political alliances, though those matter too, but because leaving fellow humans in enemy hands is simply not something we do. German, American, Russian, Chinese, whatever the flag, we're all in this together out here on the frontier." Elena felt tears beginning to form again as the full implications of what Martinez was saying began to sink in. The Americans had not rescued them out of obligation or strategic necessity. They had done it because it was the right thing to do, because the bonds of shared humanity transcended national boundaries when faced with an alien threat that sought to eliminate human presence from the galaxy entirely. The sound of approaching aircraft filled the air outside their window, the distinctive whine of human atmospheric craft that Elena had not heard in weeks. Martinez checked her communicator and nodded with satisfaction. "Transport is inbound. We'll have you back to base in 30 minutes, and from there we can arrange passage back to German space." As they prepared to leave the cell that had been their prison for so long, Elena took one last look around. The synthetic paper scattered across the floor contained the final letters that she and her soldiers had written, expecting them to be their last words to loved ones back home. Now those letters seemed like artifacts from another lifetime, reminders of how close they had come to permanent separation from everything they held dear. Lieutenant Beck approached Elena, still wrapped in her thermal blanket but looking more hopeful than she had in weeks. "Capitan, what do we do about our letters? Should we take them with us?" Elena considered the question for a moment, then shook her head slowly. "Leave them, Sarah. They belong to a different story than the one we're living now." The evacuation proceeded with military efficiency, but Elena continued to notice small details that spoke to something beyond mere professionalism. As they moved through the corridors of the detention facility, she saw American Marines stopping to check on each German soldier individually, making sure no one was left behind or struggling to keep up. When Sergeant Weber stumbled slightly due to an injury from their original capture, Marine Rodriguez immediately moved to support him without being asked. Outside the facility, the alien landscape was scarred with evidence of the recent battle. Smoking craters marked where Zephyrian defensive positions had been destroyed by American artillery, and the crystalline debris of destroyed enemy equipment glittered in the harsh light of the system's star. Elena could see the cost that had been paid for their rescue in the damaged equipment and the exhausted faces of the American soldiers. The transport aircraft that waited for them was a converted medical evacuation vessel, its hold configured with heating units and medical equipment. As Elena and her soldiers climbed aboard, they were met by additional American personnel who immediately began conducting medical assessments and distributing additional supplies. Hot soup appeared as if by magic, along with clean blankets and basic hygiene supplies that felt like incredible luxuries after their captivity. "Captain Richter," Sergeant Martinez called as Elena settled into one of the transport seats. "There's someone who wants to speak with you." Martinez handed Elena a communication headset, and after a moment of static, a clear American voice came through the connection. "Captain Richter, this is Colonel Sarah Thompson, commanding officer of the 47th Marine Expeditionary Unit. I want you to know that your rescue was our highest priority mission for the past 2 weeks. We are honored to have been able to bring you and your soldiers home safely." Elena struggled to find adequate words to respond. "Colonel Thompson, we cannot express our gratitude for what your people have done for us. The risk you accepted, the resources you committed, it goes far beyond what duty would require." There was a brief pause before Thompson responded, and when she spoke again, Elena could hear something that sounded almost like surprise in her voice. "Captain, I think you may be misunderstanding something fundamental here. This isn't about duty or obligation, though both matter. This is about who we are as human beings. When the Zephyrians threaten any of us, they threaten all of us. When they take prisoners from any human world, they attack our entire species." As the transport lifted off from the alien surface, Elena looked down through the small window at the detention facility that had been their prison. From the air, it looked small and insignificant, just another human-built structure on a hostile world far from Earth. But she knew that what had happened there would stay with her forever, not just the captivity and the fear, but the rescue and what it represented about the nature of humanity itself. The flight back to the American base took less than an hour, but during that time, Elena had the opportunity to speak with many of the soldiers who had participated in their rescue. Each conversation reinforced the same themes. These men and women had volunteered for an incredibly dangerous mission, not because they were ordered to do so, but because they could not imagine doing anything else. They spoke of their German allies not as foreign nationals or political abstractions, but as fellow human beings who deserved freedom and dignity simply by virtue of their humanity. As they approached the base, Elena could see the lights of a human settlement spread across the landscape below. After weeks of imprisonment under alien skies, the sight of human architecture and human activity filled her with an emotion so powerful that she had to close her eyes for a moment to maintain her composure. They were going home, rescued by people who had never met them but who had risked everything to ensure their safety. The American military base sprawled across the valley below them like a small city, its lights creating patterns that reminded Elena of home. As their transport settled onto the landing pad, she could see personnel rushing to meet them, medical teams and support staff working with the coordinated efficiency that marked professional military operations throughout human space. But beyond the professional response, she noticed something else. Crowds of off-duty personnel gathering around the landing area, clearly eager to welcome the rescued prisoners. The doors of the transport opened to reveal a scene that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. A medical team stood ready with equipment and stretchers, but behind them were dozens of American soldiers and support staff, many holding signs written in careful German. "Willkommen," read one. "Sichert zu Hause," declared another. Elena realized that these people had taken time from their rest periods and off-duty hours to be here, to personally welcome strangers they had never met simply because those strangers were fellow humans who had been in danger. Dr. Patricia Wells, the base chief medical officer, approached Elena as she disembarked from the transport. "Captain Richter, I'm Dr. Wells. We have medical facilities prepared for your people, but first I need to ask about immediate concerns. Anyone requiring urgent treatment?" Elena gestured toward 3 of her soldiers who were being assisted by American personnel. Those 3 have injuries from our capture, but nothing life-threatening. Our main concern has been exposure to the cold and inadequate nutrition. Dr. Wells nodded professionally, but Elena noticed that her expression showed genuine concern rather than clinical detachment. We'll get everyone checked out thoroughly, but first let's get you all somewhere warm and comfortable. The officers' quarters have been prepared for your group, with heating, clean clothes, and hot meals standing by. As they made their way through the base, Elena was struck by the interactions between her rescued soldiers and their American hosts. Language barriers seemed to dissolve as American personnel went out of their way to communicate through gestures, simple phrases, and shared smiles. She watched Klaus Weber attempting to teach a young Marine how to pronounce his name correctly, both men laughing as the American struggled with the German consonants. Lieutenant Beck walked beside Elena, still wrapped in her thermal blanket but looking more alert and hopeful than she had in weeks. "Captain," she said quietly in German, "I think I'm beginning to understand something I never learned in my military history classes." Elena looked at the young woman curiously. "What do you mean, Sarah?" "In academy, they taught us about alliances and treaties, about strategic cooperation between human governments. But this," she gestured around them at the Americans who were going far beyond duty to ensure their comfort, "this is something different. This is what makes us human rather than just another intelligent species." Elena considered this observation as they approached the quarters that had been prepared for them. The building was clearly temporary construction, but someone had taken care to make it welcoming. Plants from Earth grew in small containers near the entrance, and the windows showed evidence of recent cleaning. These were not the sterile accommodations typically provided to transient personnel, but something approaching a genuine attempt to create a sense of home. Colonel Thompson met them at the entrance, having flown in from her command position to personally greet the rescued prisoners. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had seen extensive combat, but her expression as she welcomed the German soldiers was warm and genuinely pleased. "Captain Richter," she said, offering a firm handshake, "welcome to Forward Operating Base Liberty. I know you've been through an ordeal, but I want you to know that you're safe here, and we'll get you home as soon as possible." "Colonel Thompson," Elena replied, "I still struggle to find adequate words to express our gratitude. Your people risked their lives for soldiers they had never met, from a nation they might never visit. This goes far beyond the requirements of any alliance or treaty." Thompson smiled, and for a moment the military bearing relaxed slightly. "Captain, may I share something with you?" When we received the intelligence about German prisoners at that facility, there wasn't a single discussion about whether to mount a rescue operation. The only discussions were about tactics and timing. Every single Marine in my command volunteered for the mission, including people who were scheduled for rotation back to Earth next week. Elena felt that familiar tightening in her throat that preceded tears. "But why? Surely your priorities should be your own people, your own objectives." "That's where you're wrong," Thompson said firmly. "Out here on the frontier, facing enemies like the Zephyrians who see all humans as equally worthless, your people are our people. When they took German prisoners, they attacked human civilization itself. Rescuing you wasn't a favor we did for an ally. It was defending our own species." Inside the quarters, Elena discovered that the Americans had prepared individual rooms for each of the officers and shared accommodations for the enlisted personnel that maintained military hierarchy while providing privacy and comfort. More significantly, each room contained items that showed careful thought. German language books downloaded from Earth databases, photographs of German landscapes printed from digital archives, even small German flags placed respectfully on desks. The mess hall that evening became the site of an impromptu celebration that Elena knew would remain with her forever. American and German soldiers sat together at tables, sharing stories and attempting to communicate across language barriers with the enthusiasm of people who had found unexpected friendship. The American cooks had somehow managed to prepare recognizable German dishes alongside their own rations, and Elena watched with amazement as young Marines struggled with unfamiliar foods, while her own soldiers laughed and provided pronunciation lessons for German words. Sergeant Martinez approached Elena's table carrying 2 cups of coffee and a slightly embarrassed expression. "Captain, I hope you don't mind the question, but several of my people are curious about something. In your military training, do they teach you about American culture and customs? Because we've noticed that your soldiers seem to understand things about us that we didn't expect." Elena accepted the coffee gratefully and considered the question. "Sergeant, I think what your people are seeing is not knowledge of American culture specifically, but recognition of shared human values. When your Marine Rodriguez spent extra time ensuring each of my soldiers was properly cared for, my people recognized the same impulse that would drive German soldiers to care for wounded enemies. When Colonel Thompson risked resources and lives for foreign prisoners, we saw the same commitment to human dignity that we hope to embody ourselves." Martinez nodded slowly, clearly thinking about Elena's words. "So you're saying that what makes us allies isn't our governments or our treaties, but something more fundamental?" "Exactly," Elena said. "The Zephyrians have technology that surpasses ours in many ways, but they lack something essential that every human culture shares. They cannot conceive of sacrificing for those who provide no direct benefit to themselves. They cannot understand why American Marines would risk their lives for German prisoners, or why German soldiers would die protecting civilian evacuees they had never met." The conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Beck approaching their table with an expression of excitement. "Capitan, you need to see this," she said in German, then switched to English for Martinez's benefit. "The base communications center has received messages for us." Elena followed Sarah to the communications center, where a young technician was printing out a series of messages that had been transmitted through the military communication networks. The first was from Elena's sister Maria on Earth, expressing relief and gratitude for her rescue and safe recovery. But as Elena read through the stack of messages, she realized that they came from all across human space. German civilians expressing thanks to American forces, American families sending welcome greetings to German soldiers, messages from Russian, Chinese, and European colonies offering support and congratulations. "How did news of our rescue spread so quickly?" Elena asked the technician. "Ma'am, the story has been picked up by civilian news networks throughout human space. The headline I saw was, 'American Marines risk everything to rescue German prisoners.' It's being called one of the greatest examples of human cooperation in the war against the Zephyrian Empire." Elena stared at the messages, realizing that their rescue had become something larger than a simple military operation. It had become a symbol of what humanity could be when faced with existential threats. An example of the bonds that connected humans regardless of national origin or political differences. That night, as Elena lay in a real bed with clean sheets and adequate heating for the first time in weeks, she found herself reflecting on the events of the day and their larger significance. The Zephyrians had superior technology, greater numbers, and the cold logic of a hive-mind species that never questioned orders or hesitated in the face of tactical advantages. But they lacked something that even the youngest human soldier possessed instinctively: the ability to recognize the essential worth of individuals, even those from different tribes or nations. The rescue operation had cost the Americans significant resources and had put numerous lives at risk for people they had never met and might never see again. By any logical calculation, based on military efficiency or national interest, the operation should never have been approved. But humans, Elena realized, were not creatures of pure logic. They were beings capable of sacrifice, empathy, and cooperation that transcended immediate self-interest. The next morning brought preparations for Elena and her soldiers' return to German space. Transport had been arranged through neutral territory, and medical clearances had been completed with efficiency that spoke to the professionalism of American military logistics. But as Elena prepared to say goodbye to the people who had saved their lives, she found herself struggling with emotions that had no clear military equivalent. Colonel Thompson presented each of the rescued German soldiers with a small medallion bearing the insignia of the 47th Marine Expeditionary Unit. "These are not official decorations," she explained, "but personal tokens from everyone who participated in your rescue. We want you to remember that somewhere in human space you have friends who would do anything to help you." Elena accepted her medallion with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. "Colonel, I promise you that this experience has changed how I understand our war against the Zephyrians. We are not fighting as separate nations who happen to share common enemies. We are fighting as members of a single human family, defending not just our colonies or our governments, but our essential nature as beings capable of compassion and sacrifice." As their transport prepared for departure, Elena looked back at Forward Operating Base Liberty and the people who had given them a future they had thought was lost forever. The war against the Zephyrian Empire would continue, and there would be more battles, more casualties, more tests of human resolve. But Elena now carried with her absolute proof that humanity possessed something no alien technology could replicate or defeat: the capacity to risk everything for others, to find meaning in sacrifice, and to discover family bonds with strangers who shared nothing but common humanity. The transport lifted off into the alien sky, carrying its precious cargo toward home and safety. But Elena knew that the real victory had already been won, not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through the simple act of Americans who brought warm blankets instead of indifference, who saw fellow humans instead of foreign nationals, and who proved that the bonds of species transcended all lesser loyalties. In a galaxy full of cold logic and calculating intelligence, humanity's greatest strength remained its capacity for love.